ladies and gentlemen. Always a pleasure to see you all here. Always a pleasure to tell you these stories. We're going to be talking this morning about Iceland. And I know some of you are thinking we're already there because it's a little cool in the room, which puts me in mind of a story. I had a grandfather who came from Russia, and he used to tell about two peasants who met one morning in the central square of the little village. And one of the peasants said to the other one, "Have you heard the news? They've moved the border again. We're back in Poland." And the other one said, "Thank God, I couldn't take another Russian winter." We are talking about Reykjavik. We are talking about a city of fire and ice. We are talking about Iceland, which is a country of fire and ice. And when we tell these stories, this is the last story we're going to be telling on this cruise. And so I have to just take a moment and thank Chris back in the booth for making all of this possible. The lights, the sound. Without him, you wouldn't see me, you wouldn't hear me. All of the techs are wonderful. They make us visible. They make us able to do what we do. And I think Chris deserves a hand for what he does. Thank you, Chris. We are talking about a city, Reykjavik, which was founded in the year 870 AD. 870 AD, it was founded by a Viking by the name of Ingemar Arnason. This is a statue of him. It's in Reykjavik. It's on a little park near the harbor. You can see it if you want to go and find it. And he was a Viking, and the story of Reykjavik, the story of Iceland, is the story of the Vikings. Fascinating people. All of us know some things about the Vikings, maybe not exactly the truth, however. But when we talk about the Vikings, I always start with a prayer that first was heard on the 8th of June in the year 793, and it's in Latin. And it means, "From the fury of the Northmen, free us, O Lord. A furore de Nordmen, libera nos Domini." And it was first heard off the northeastern coast of England, a little island called Lindisfarne, where there had been a great monastery. Out of the mists of the North Sea, a Viking fleet landed. The Vikings came ashore, and as a contemporary wrote, "The ravages of heathen men destroyed God's great monastery on Lindisfarne with plunder and with slaughter." The Vikings swept down the west coast of Europe, across into the Mediterranean, from Scotland to Sicily. That same prayer rose regularly. A French monk named Abbo wrote of the Vikings, "These wild beasts ranged through hills and fields, killing babies, fathers, sons, mothers. They thought it was the wrath of God. They thought it was a reflection of Judgment Day, which was coming." But when I talk about the Vikings, there's an interesting fact. In the 19th century, in the United States, there was a folk philosopher named Josh Billings. And Josh Billings had a saying. He said, "The things that get us in trouble ain't the things we don't know. They're the things we do know that ain't so." Now, a lot of what we know about the Vikings ain't so. And the first thing is their name. They never called themselves Vikings, and no one else ever called them Vikings. They were the Norse. They were the men of the North. Their victims called them the Northmen. The word Viking doesn't appear anywhere until late in the 12th century, a good 100, 150 years after the age of the Vikings was over, and we don't know where the word comes from. It may come from an Old Norse word, vik, which means an inlet or a port, and it's attached to a number of places today. For example, the port of Narvik in Norway, or Berwick in England, or Wicklow in Ireland, or Reykjavik. Where did they come from? About 3000 BC, a people known as the Samoyed, reindeer herders, peaceful people, came across the northern tier of Europe and into Scandinavia from western Siberia. They settled, they were peaceful, but about 1,500 years later, 1500 BC or so, the Celts moved into Europe. They changed everything. And a group of them, Teutonic Celts, came across the Baltic Sea into Scandinavia. They drove those Samoyeds far to the north. They're still there today. We call them the Laplanders. They call themselves the Sami. But these people, these Teutonic Celts, were the Scans. And they were a gifted people. They knew how to work certain things. They worked bronze very well. And they were great experts at working amber. Amber is fossilized tree sap. It's very plentiful all around the Baltic. And when it's properly done, it has two remarkable properties. One is that it seems to be lit from inside, sort of a golden interior glow. The other is that if you rub amber, it will pick up little bits of paper, little bits of cloth. We know today that's static electricity. I don't know if the people 1500 BC knew it, but they knew something, because the Greek word for amber is the word electron. So maybe they were putting things together. But traders from the south, as far back as the Greeks, traveled to the north to get amber and other goods as well. In 300 BC, a Greek by the name of Pythias from the Greek city of Massalia in the Mediterranean, it is today the city of Marseille, sailed up the west coast of Scandinavia. He sailed to Britain for tin, and then he sailed on to the very far north to a place that he said was the source of the furs that they traded, a place he named Ultima Thule. We today think Ultima Thule may well have been Iceland. But the Romans came. There are a lot of Roman silver and gold coins in Viking graves today. In 10 BC, Caesar Augustus sent a Roman fleet into the Baltic to map the coastline of Scandia. And in 60 AD, the Roman Emperor Nero sent another fleet to refine those graphs and charts. In 109 AD, the Roman writer Tacitus wrote about them, people he called the Suiones, the Swedes. He said their powerful fleets control the Baltic, and their ships are unusual because they have a prow at either end. He was describing the design that would one day be the Viking longboat. And in 550 AD, a man by the name of Jordanus, who was a Byzantine writing in Byzantium, wrote of them. The Vikings came down the Russian rivers and across the Black Sea to trade in Byzantium. And he wrote of them, these people are stronger in both body and spirit than the Germans, and they are taller than other men. We know he was right about that. Skeletons recovered from Scandinavian graves of the Viking period averaged 5'8" in height. This at a time when the average European male was about 5'2". So they were tall. They were big. Not everybody who wrote about them was complimentary. An Arab, Ibn Fadlan, a famous traveler, he was an emissary of the Emir of Baghdad, and he traded with the Vikings on the Volga River in the year 920, and he wrote of them, these are the finest physical specimens I have ever seen, taller than date palms, but they are God's filthiest people. They never wash their hands after natural functions, neither do they wash their hands before they eat. A gentleman by the name of Al-Tartushi, an Arab writing in Cordoba, wrote of them, I have never heard more terrible singing. So it is as beastly as dogs. And Adam of Brevin, a German historian, wrote of them, they wear the skins of wild animals, and when they talk to one another, they don't use words, they just gnash their teeth. But the Russian Primary Chronicle, which is the earliest written record of Russian history, speaks of huge, tangle-haired men, so wild, so rough, that their very appearance denotes their bloodthirstiness. These men, of vast frame and great courage, know not defeat. They didn't know defeat because they didn't fear death. To them, death was nothing. All that mattered was how you died. Did you die honorably? Did you die well? In the Havamal, a great saga from the Viking days, the god Odin is quoted as saying, all things die, men die. What I know that does not die is the verdict on each dead man. If a man died dishonorably, if a man died in a shameful manner, the goddess Hel swept him up and carried him into the underworld, a terrible, murky place. But if a man died honorably, if a man died in battle, Valkyrie, special winged goddesses, would ride down and pick him up. The word Valkyrie means choosers of the dead, and carry him to Asgard, the garden of the gods, where he would live in Odin's great hall of Valhalla, the hall of the chosen, and fight and feast with other heroes forever. Christian missionaries came into Scandinavia probably by the middle of the 9th century, and interestingly, the Vikings easily converted, but they converted their own way. One Viking was asked, after having converted to Christianity, "What do you believe in now?" He said, "I believe in my own strength." He wasn't all that converted, but they did believe in their own strength. They loved combat, they loved to fight, they loved their arms and armor, and this brings me to another myth about the Vikings. The absolutely overriding image of a Viking today is the horned helmet. Every Viking has a horned helmet. We know that. Draw a horned helmet and you're looking at a Viking. Well, we being modern man, several hundred Viking helmets recovered from graves, recovered from battle sites. They look like that. That's a Viking helmet, no horns. One group of Vikings only went into battle and still go into battle wearing horned helmets, and that, of course, are the Minnesota Vikings, an American professional football team, for those of you who don't know. But the Vikings came by boat. The Vikings had the great Viking longboat. I don't believe we have an image of a longboat yet. The sailing routes in the 9th, 10th, 11th century hugged the coastline. Nobody sailed out of sight of land. If you were out on the open ocean, you were lost. It's trackless. But the Vikings could navigate across the open sea. They could navigate to Iceland, to Greenland, all the way to North America. And what they used was a little piece of wood called the sunboard. It's just a disc with a wooden post mounted in the center and a few markings on it. At noon, when the sun was at its highest every day, they floated this in a bowl of water so it was absolutely level, and they measured the height of the shadow. And by doing that, and with a few calculations, they could determine their position north and south on the globe. They didn't know about the North Pole or the equator or the idea of latitude, but they knew if they knew their position north-south and followed it, they could get where they wanted to go. 600 years later, the Arabs would invent the brass astrolabe, which did the same thing more sophisticatedly. But the Vikings did it. The Vikings could neither read nor write, but they did this, and they figured it out in their head. And they came by the longboat. The Viking longboat was a remarkable craft. Light, it could sail over sandbars, it could sail far up rivers to trade or to raid. You could run it right on the beach, do whatever you wanted to do, and then just a few men could push it back out to sea. But it was strong enough to deal with the open ocean. The keel of every longboat was cut from a single oak tree trunk, a massive T-shaped keel, very light, immensely strong. It carried them across the oceans. They loved their boats. Sailors loved their boats. The Vikings loved their boats. In Beowulf, the great 8th century saga, someone has written, "Over breaking billows with bellying sail and a foamy beak like a flying bird, the ship sped on." Whoever wrote that loved a boat. And the Vikings decorated their boats. We all know about the prow. They always carved a figure into the stem post, often a spiral, sometimes the figure of a beast, a wolf, a dragon, whatever. And down the stem posts, they also carved a remarkable figure, an interwoven dragon-like figure that we call the interwoven beast. It looks very oriental, but it's not. They worked it into their silver. You can see it here, worked into this silver piece of Danish silver. Wings, scale. What the interwoven beast was, we don't know, but the Vikings had it everywhere, on their silver, on their rune stones. The Vikings sailed their boats all across Europe, into the Mediterranean, into the Black Sea, across the Atlantic. They were raiders, cruel, but they were also something else. If they had only been raiders, we wouldn't remember them today. They also were traders. They raided, but they settled and they established. They built cities, they established trade routes, they created whole countries. When they reached Ireland, Ireland had nothing, no towns, monasteries, and they raided them, but they settled in Ireland. And in order to settle in Ireland, they built ports for their boats. And the Viking ports became Cork, Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, and Dublin. They introduced coinage. They did the same in England. The word Chester in England means market. Every town in Chester that has a market in it was once a Viking town. Winchester, Portchester, the city of Chester itself. The Vikings in the 9th century captured all of England north of the Thames, from London to the city of Chester itself. They called it the Danelaw because the Danish Vikings ruled. Knut was a Dane. He ruled for 21 years. But one of the things that the Vikings did by establishing trade, by establishing commerce everywhere, was they built up the strength, they built up the ability of these places to resist them. Why did the Vikings come in the first place? We don't know, but we think possibly, at least I think probably, it was because there was an opportunity here. The Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD. Relatively large kingdoms quickly followed the Roman Empire, but then they fell apart. The Dark Ages destroyed all of that, leaving just little tiny fiefdoms scattered everywhere, too small to resist a Viking raid. No 1,000 Vikings could plunder England, but they could plunder Wessex, they could plunder Mercia, little kingdoms that were there instead of a unified England. But over the years, with the trade they established and the commerce and the profit it produced, these places got stronger. Strong enough to resist the Vikings, strong enough to drive the Vikings out. In the 11th century, the English Saxons, after King Knut the Dane died, established Edward the Confessor as a Viking, anti-Viking king, as a Saxon king. He ruled for 31 years. Edward the Confessor died on the 6th of January in the year 1066. The Saxons nominated a new Viking, the Earl of Wessex, Harold Godwinson, to be their king. But there were two claimants to the throne besides him, two other men who thought that should be their throne. One was the Duke of Normandy, a man by the name of William. Normandy existed because in the year 911, a Viking by the name of Gongu Hrolf, it means Hrolf the Walker, he was so big no horse could carry him. He sailed a fleet into the Seine River. He was too strong for the French king, Charles the Bald, France was very weak in those years, to drive him out. So Charles actually ceded the lower Seine to Hrolf, who became a Christian, took the name of Roland. The city of Rouen was part of what he got. He became the Count of Rouen. And over the next 5 generations, his holdings expanded to the coast and west. And his Northmen, remember they didn't call themselves Vikings, his Northmen settled in this area, the land of the Northmen. And the land of the Northmen became the land of the Normans, their dukedom, the dukedom of Normandy. William was the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Hrolf, and he thought he was entitled to the throne. But there was also another. This is Harald Hardrada, another Norwegian who thought the throne of England should be his. And so at the same time that William of Normandy was invading across the Channel, Harald Hardrada sailed a 300-ship Viking fleet into the Humber River in northern England to claim the throne for himself. King Harold had put together an army. When he learned of this Viking invasion in the north, he forced marched his whole army north, all the way across England. Harald Hardrada had taken the city of York. They met at a battle 8 miles south of York, one of the great battles in English history. It's completely forgotten, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. King Harold destroyed Hardrada's army, killed Hardrada himself, then turned his army around, forced marched them south, and 19 days later, on the 14th of October, at Hastings, they met in the Battle of Hastings. Harold's army was somewhat reduced in size. Harold's army was somewhat weakened. William the Conqueror met him with a more powerful force. Still, the battle raged on until an arrow from the Normans pierced King Harold's visor and killed him. William became the conqueror of Norway, of England, became the new king of England, and his Normans became the rulers. But those Normans, 5 centuries earlier, were Northmen. Vikings still, in a sense, ruled England. Trade brought people from the south. Trade to the north for a variety of things. White bears, falcons, seal oil, eiderdown, Swedish iron, honey, malt, wax, and of course, amber. 3 things that the Vikings traded that were the most profitable items were furs, ivory, and slaves. Furs, of course, came from the far north, probably not from Iceland, but ships brought the furs down past the west coast of Scandinavia on a route to the Viking trading centers in the Baltic. And that route came to be known as the Great North Way, south, down the west coast of Scandinavia. And the Great North Way soon enough was applied not only to the sea route, but to the coast they sailed past. That coast became also the Great North Way. Today, of course, we just call it Norway. The ivory that the Vikings sold was primarily walrus ivory. They killed walruses, collected their tusks, and they sold that ivory for weight. But they had another kind of ivory they sold not for weight, because there was an Arctic beluga whale. This is the narwhal, relatively rare, but it lives in the Arctic. The Vikings knew of it. The word narwhal is a Norse word. It means corpse whale, because they like to float with their belly showing, and it was white. They're not very big, but a 16-foot narwhal will grow a single spirally grooved, the twist is to the right, tusk right out of the middle of their face. Every male narwhal grows one. We don't know why they have them, but the Vikings knew of this. They would kill narwhal, they would take this tusk, and they would sell it, not as ivory, but as the horn of the legendary unicorn. Big price, big price. And then, of course, there were slaves. Vikings had slaves. They called them thralls. Many of them were prisoners of war. But although the Norwegian and Danish Vikings went west into the Atlantic and down the coast of Europe, Swedish Vikings went east across the Baltic to the eastern end of the Baltic, and then into the lands to the east of that, the lands of the Slavic peoples, the land of the great unbroken northern forest. Lots of people, no government. They routinely captured young male and young female Slavs and kept some as their own slaves and sold some as well. Our word slave comes from the word Slav. The Slavic people had a word for these Vikings. The Vikings that came from the Baltic, they spoke of using a Finnish word, the word rutski, which means a Swede. And from that, they developed their word for these Swedish Vikings. They called them the Rus. And in the 8th century, they went to the leader of the Rus, a man named Rurik, and said to him, "We are a great people, but we have no order. Will you rule over us?" And so the Vikings did. And the kingdom they established was named for them. It's the country of Russia, established not only for Vikings, but named for Vikings. Well, Reykjavik was started. Iceland was established by Arneson in 870 AD. About 100 years later, Leif Erikson moved on west and discovered Greenland. And when he discovered Greenland, he called it Greenland because it was green. The world was a lot warmer back in the 9th, 10th, 11th century, and the coasts of Greenland were green. He established farming communities there, which thrived. For about 4 centuries, villages were built, families grew, there was regular communication by ship back and forth from Scandinavia, products were shipped back home. But then about 1300, the climate turned cold. Cold enough that the farms died. The ships stopped coming. The people left on Greenland were isolated and forgotten. The last of them died knowing that they would die alone, unmourned and unburied. But Iceland did not suffer that fate. Iceland stayed warm. It's farther north than much of Greenland, but it stayed relatively warm. And the reason is that it sits right on the mid-Atlantic ridge. What's that? The continents are moving. All the continents float on the semi-liquid, heavier magma rock beneath. And the North American plate, which is North America, and the Eurasian plate, which meet in the middle of the Atlantic, are separating. They're moving apart. Iceland sits right on the ridge. That's the yellow mark is the ridge itself. And these are the two, the North American plate and the Eurasian plate, and they are moving away from each other. And as they move away from each other, they are tearing open the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, which is the crust of the Earth. And as they do this, this liquid magma from below flows out and spreads across the floor, forming new land constantly, about a centimeter a year. Not very fast for us, very fast geologically. But about 20 million years ago, for reasons we don't know, this happens in various places in the world, what we call a plume formed. This is a place where not only does the magma spread across the ocean floor, but it rises all the way to the surface. And when it rose to the surface, it formed Iceland. So Iceland stays warm because this plume of liquid magma that's flowing up into it is hot. And Iceland is an area of great geological activity. About 200 volcanoes exist in Iceland because of this plume that feeds them. Eruptions are very common, about once every 3 years. More than that, however, there is this enormous quantity of geothermal heat right at their feet. And Iceland uses that geothermal heat. They take this constant upwelling of heat and they use that to heat their homes. 87% of all buildings in Iceland are heated by the geothermal heat that flows up from below. Their houses, their office buildings, their swimming pools, they heat the pavement in their cities to melt the ice. Not only that, not only do they have constant eruptions, they also, of course, have great fields of hot water and steam and constant geysers, boiling hot water that bursts forth in these great cascades. The word geyser is part of our language because on Iceland there is a geyser named Geyser. It's as simple as that. They use that heat to generate electricity. Iceland generates all the electricity they need from the geothermal heat at their feet. Not for free, but almost. This is a building in the city of Reykjavik they call the Pertland, the Pearl. In this building, all of this geothermal heat is converted into electricity for the whole city of Reykjavik. All that electricity is extremely cheap, and it powers everything. They have a big industry in Iceland today of refining bauxite into aluminum. It's there for one reason only. Iceland has an almost unlimited quantity of very cheap electricity. You need a lot of electricity to turn bauxite into aluminum. They do it in Iceland. Portland is easy to visit. I'll probably visit it tomorrow. You can see how they do this, how they generate all this geothermal heat, all this geothermal energy that they're sitting on top of. On the one hand, causes volcanic eruptions, which can be a problem. On the other hand, it gives them essentially free heat and free hot water and free electricity. So it's not a bad deal. But Iceland sits at 64 degrees north, very far north, out of the shipping lanes, sort of remote, and as a consequence, it is very rarely visited over the centuries. Iceland was founded by Vikings 1,000 years ago, and over the 1,000 years, it has been very little affected by immigration. Very few people have ever left, and very, very few people have ever come. As a result, the Icelanders of today are direct descendants of Vikings 1,000 years ago. More than that, most Icelanders know their family tree name by name all the way back. It is an absolutely pure, perfect line. Very few outsiders ever came in. It is a genetic researchers' paradise. And genetic researchers come to Iceland all the time to research these very simple, direct lines of descent and learn whatever they can about all the remarkable things that go together to give me brown eyes and some of you blue. Icelandic language is fascinating. Old Icelandic, of course, was never written down. The Vikings could neither read nor write. So Old Icelandic was a spoken language. When Christianity finally got to Iceland about the 12th century, the missionaries brought Bibles. And of course, in order to read a Bible, you have to be able to, or in order to use a Bible, you have to be able to read it. And so Icelandic was written down. In the 12th and 13th centuries, with the introduction of a written language, the old Icelandic sagas began to be written down. These sagas are somewhat fantastical, fairy tale-like descriptions of remarkable events, heroes and villains, except they deal with real people. They mention real people. They are the way the Icelanders kept their oral history. And in the 12th and 13th centuries, these sagas were written for the first time. Probably the most notable writer was a 13th century Icelander by the name of Snorri Sturluson. Snorri Sturluson wrote a book called the Heimskringla. The Heimskringla, this is it, is the great book of sagas. The Heimskringla, we don't have a 13th century version still, but some very, very old versions of it are in the National Library in Reykjavik today. On display, the National Library in Reykjavik is right next door to the National Museum, so it's worth a visit. And Snorri Sturluson is remembered for two things. This is one of them. He died in the year 1241. The other thing he's remembered for is the Icelandic Parliament. It's called the Althing. The Althing was met for the first time in the year 930. The place they met is a place called Þingvellir, which means the field of the Althing. It's a place in the countryside of Iceland, which is actually where the mid-Atlantic ridge comes to the surface. It is a place of tortured rock, huge ravines. This is where the first meeting and the subsequent meetings of the Icelandic Parliament were held. Anyone could attend. Any citizen could take part. Any citizen could listen, could debate. They made their laws. There was a certain rock in the middle of all of this called the Logberg, or the Law Rock. On that, the law speaker, the man who conducted the parliament, sat. Snorri Sturluson himself was the lawgiver in the year 1215. And the lawgiver's function was to recite the appropriate part of the law that applied to any issue being debated, to help make it easier for everyone to decide. In the year 1798, the Althing moved into a building in Reykjavik, but it is still meeting today. It has met continuously for 1,085 years. It is by far the oldest continuously meeting parliament in the history of the world. Reykjavik was created initially as a little agricultural area. There is an old model village outside the city which represents more or less what it looked like to live in Reykjavik 1,000 years ago. You can visit this. And Reykjavik was developed into a center for the gathering of wool. Sheep have always been important on Iceland. Icelandic wool was gathered in Reykjavik. It was the #1 business for centuries. When the age of the Vikings ended, first Norway and then Denmark took control of Iceland. Denmark controlled Iceland from 1279 until the Second World War. In the year 1752, King Frederick V of Denmark turned over the ownership of the little town of Reykjavik to a commercial entity known as the Innrættingar, and they developed new industries, not just wool. They developed sulfur mining, fishing, shipbuilding, agriculture. Reykjavik grew from a village into a town. In 1786, it was named the colonial capital of Iceland, and it later became the national capital, of course. And Reykjavik is today not only the national capital of Iceland, it is the northernmost capital of any country in the world. On the 9th of April, 1940, during World War II, the Germans marched into Denmark. And this caused a rift because Iceland has a strategic position in the North Atlantic. On the 10th of May, 4 British warships anchored in Reykjavik harbor. Iceland welcomed them as allies, and this ruptured the tie between Denmark and Iceland. Denmark was German-controlled. Iceland was now controlled by the British and the Americans. Iceland became independent in 1944. The British built an RAF station called Reykjavik Station. It is today the Reykjavik domestic airport, literally inside the city. And the American Army Air Force built Keflavik Air Base outside Reykjavik, and it is now Keflavik International Airport. We have some interesting things to visit, not only in Reykjavik, but near it. And of course, all of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Blue Lagoon, which is a few miles outside of the city. It's a spot where underground waters flow up from 6,500 feet below ground, spread out into a relatively shallow lagoon, which is quite warm. The water is startlingly blue, not just because it sits where it sits, but because it's surrounded by black lava rock and, of course, the blue sky if it happens to be a clear day. And this is a place where the Icelanders think this water has got a great high content of silica and other minerals which make it blue. They think it's good for your skin. I wouldn't vouch for that, but you can swim in it if you like. If you visit the Blue Lagoon, there are bathing facilities, and you can bathe in it as well. Thingvellir, which is the spot where the Althing first met, because it's literally where the Mid-Atlantic Ridge reached the surface. There's a high level of volcanic activity in that area. A lot of volcanoes have been there and have erupted. There are vast lava fields that you can walk across if you're interested. Tours will take you right up to the edge of the volcanoes if you're of a mind to do that sort of thing. You can visit the geysers with appropriate tours. You can visit the Pearl in Reykjavik with appropriate tours. One other thing I'll point out, and that is that the tallest building in Reykjavik is a church, which is sort of amusing. It's a Lutheran church. That's the Church of Iceland. This is the church and its name, and I guarantee you that my spoken Icelandic is not good. It is the Hallgrímskirkja. It's 244 feet high. My Icelandic is not all that good. Modern Icelanders today can read the old sagas if they're printed with updated spelling in the old language, because it hasn't changed very much. Many of them can even read it in the old language with the old spelling. And many speakers of Icelandic can understand spoken Icelandic with a little difficulty, but nobody else can. In any case, this is a modern Lutheran church. It's ironic because although they have this beautiful church, nobody goes. Iceland is an extremely secular country. They're very happy that way. But there's an observation point at the top of that tower. It's 244 feet high. There's an elevator. You can ride it up. In 1992, the Icelandic congregation installed a new organ that was built in Germany. It has 5,275 pipes. And if you go to the Hallgrímskirkja, you can not only stand at the top, you see a view of the entire city of Reykjavik, you can see the mountains in the distance, and you can listen to the organ. It brings me to the end of this story. It has been my great pleasure to do all of this. In just a moment, we have a little time for questions. Let me just point out that my wife, Carol, and I will be in the apropos shop after the talk. We have recordings there of our various albums, our travels all around the world. If you're interested, stop by. We have printouts that list them, and the shop will be open for part of the rest of the day. So it will be our pleasure to see you there. Now, if anyone has any questions about today or anything else I've spoken of, or for that matter, anything else in the news, Greece, anyone? Anyone with a question? This is the moment. Sir.
Yes. I understand that large computer companies are now building buildings in Reykjavik where they can house their computer equipment because it's a lot less expensive to cool the equipment in Iceland than it is other places. Is that true? Have you heard of this?
The gentleman is asking a question. Is it true that large computer companies are now building facilities in Reykjavik to house their equipment, their servers probably, because it's much cheaper to cool them here than in other major cities of the world? The answer is yes. It's happening for the same reason that they're building aluminum factories all over Iceland. Alcoa has an enormous factory on the shoreline because the electricity is so extremely cheap. It's extremely cheap because it all comes from the geothermal heat, which is essentially free. They charge, but they don't charge a lot. I believe 0.1% of Iceland's electricity is generated by burning fossil fuels. All the rest of it is from geothermal heat that they're standing on. So you're right. Do we have any other questions? Well, if we don't, let me make one last comment, because this is our last meeting. A wise man once pointed out, not just to me, but to many teachers, that if you teach, you will be taught by your students. I have to tell you, over the past few days, in conversations and answering questions with many of you, you have taught me a lot. You have been a wonderful audience. Thank you all so much for coming to these talks.